to you Dr. Ursula Heise, who is Professor of English at UCLA, where she is also a faculty member of the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. Professor Heise, who originally hails from Germany and grew up in my hometown of Cologne, was a 2011 Guggenheim Fellow, as well as the president of the Association for the Study of Literature and the Environment. Prior to her appointment at UCLA, she was professor of English at Stanford, where she also served as director of the Modern Thought and Literature program. Professor Heise has authored well over 60 essays and reviews, which have appeared not only in English, but also in German, French, and in Japanese. She's the author and editor of 5 books, including the highly influential monograph Sense of Place, Sense of Planet, which Oxford University Press published in 2008, as well as Chronoschisms, Time, Narrative, and Postmodernism, which Cambridge University published in 1997, and as co-editor, the Longman Anthology of World Literature's volume on 20th century literature. Professor Heise's work is situated at the intersection of contemporary environmental culture, literature, and art in the Americas, Western Europe, and Japan, theories of globalization, and the field known as digital humanities. Her talk this evening, which draws on her current book project, which is tentatively entitled Where the Wild Things Used to Be, Narrative, Database, and Endangered Species, is entitled BioCities, Urban Futures, and the Reinvention of Nature. Please help me welcome our 17th Humanities on the Edge speaker, Professor Ursula Heise.
Thank you so much, Marco, for the kind introduction, and thank you for letting me be part of what has been obviously such a long-standing conversation. So the particular edge of the humanities that my own work hails from is the environmental humanities, which is a relatively new term that's only been started to be used over the last 5 to 7 or so years. And what that term usually means is an interdisciplinary field that includes environmental history, environmental philosophy, and eco-criticism, as well as the sort of environmentally oriented strands of research in some quantitative social sciences, like cultural and biological anthropology, gender studies, cultural geography, and political science. All of these fields, integrating all of these fields is harder than you might think, except perhaps in Australia, where under the label of ecological humanities, anthropologists, philosophers, and literary scholars have already collaborated quite a bit. In the US, this is still rare. Environmental historians and literary scholars have collaborated quite a bit, but the other collaborations are only beginning to emerge. And the difficulty is not just working across disciplines, but also working across divisions within disciplines. Philosophy is notoriously divided between continental and analytic philosophy, and they have quite different takes on environmental issues. Anthropology is so divided that in some places there's actually 2 departments between cultural and biological anthropology, both of which speak to environmental issues. So it's quite a task, but what has made it compelling is the sense of an overarching global ecological crisis or set of crises that the humanities must speak to. And so, whereas the vocabulary of state of exception a la Agamben is not very frequently used in environmentalism, there is that sense of global crisis that requires exceptional interventions on the part of academics as well as activists to address. And you all know some of that rhetoric around climate change. So in the context of what the ruling concepts, methods, and theories for this emerging field of environmental humanities might be, my talk today is going to focus on 2. One is the Anthropocene, and the other one is urbanization as sort of the ecosystems which will inhabit in the future. And I'll talk about both of those theoretically in a little more detail later on, but let me just jump right in and start you out with a passage from literature that speaks explicitly to the future and more implicitly to the theoretical foundations of environmentalist thought and writing in a time of global crisis. Terminator rolls around Mercury, just like its sunwalkers, moving at the speed of the planet's rotation gliding over 20 gigantic elevated tracks, which together hold aloft and push west, a town quite a bit bigger than Venice. The 20 tracks run around Mercury like a narrow wedding band, keeping near the 45th latitude south, but with wide detours to the south and north to avoid the worst of the planet's long escarpments. The city moves at an average of 5 kilometers an hour. The sleeves on the underside of the city are fitted over the tracks at a tolerance so fine that the thermal expansion of the track's austenite stainless steel is always pushing the city west onto the narrower tracks still in the shade. The city, sliding at its stately pace, completes a revolution every 177 days. Round after round, nothing changing, except the land itself. And the land only changes because the sunwalkers include landscape artists who are out there polishing mirror cliffs, carving petroglyphs, erecting cairns and dolmens in Inuksut, and arranging blocks and lines of metal to expose to the melt of the day. Thus, Terminator citizens glide continuously and walk over their world, remaking it day by day into something more expressive of their thoughts. All cities and all their citizens move in just such a way. Now, those of you who are in literature probably recognize the narrative idiom of this description, though you may not know the novel. The idiom is that of Italo Calvino's Le Città Invisibile, a novel from 1972. That's where the illusion from Venice comes from, and the sort of seemingly allegorical conclusion. The text is 2312, a science fiction novel by Kim Stanley Robinson that appeared appropriately enough in 2012, 300 years before the worlds it portrays. And it's worlds in the plural because in this vision of the early 24th century, humans have settled on several other planets and moons in the solar system, including Mercury, and though that requires pretty ingenious technology of the kind that is described in the paragraph, because that planet is obviously far too close to the sun to be fully exposed to it. So for life to be fully exposed to it on it. So Terminator, the mobile city that moves like a moon around its planet, attached but not anchored to its soil, exemplifies Robinson's vision of the perfect integration of ecology, technology, and inhabitation. Now, as the last sentence suggests, this integration doesn't stop at the city proper, but includes large parts of the planet's surface. So there are all of these artsy and design-oriented Mercurians who keep reshaping it in ongoing processes of landscape art on the model of Andy Goldsworthy, who is mentioned a lot in this novel. They alter the shapes and colors of the geological formations, inscribe them, paint paintings on them, to the point where one of the artist designers reflects during a visit to a museum on Earth why you would want to paint art on a canvas when you can do it on a landscape or a living body instead. So planet, landscape, city, and humans are in slow but constant motion, and slowly but incessantly transform both the land and their own bodies through activities that are to varying degrees geological, ecological, and aesthetic. It's an interesting vision, not just because Robinson is only one of very few utopian authors currently living and breathing. As I'm sure you know, by far the majority of novelists in the speculative fiction genre, as well as outside to a large extent, prefer to portray human life on this and other planets as bleakly dystopian. And Robinson, too, paints a somewhat pessimistic picture of Earth in the 24th century. But the human habitats on Mercury, Mars, Venus, and various moons highlight humans' creativity and reinventions of nature rather than their destruction. And in that dual portrait, he plays on one of the more important concepts to have emerged in discussions of our current crisis and our future on this planet, as well as in discussions about the future of environmentalism, the environmental humanities, and eco-criticism, and that is the Anthropocene. Now, as you may know, the term Anthropocene was coined in a brief article in 2000 by the ecologist Eugene Sturmer and the atmospheric scientist Paul Crutzen. Rather than the Holocene, which we've supposedly inhabited for the last 12,000 or so years, they suggest, we now live in the age of humans because our species has transformed itself from a biological to a geological agent on planet Earth. So we've altered even the atmospheric and meteorological environment of the global ecosystem, and our impact makes itself felt even where humans do not go in their own bodies. So even very remote land areas and deep layers of the ocean are transformed by climate change and ocean acidification. And this impact will be visible even in the geological strata in a way that's never happened before. Geologists will take until 2016 to determine whether the evidence warrants this change of name. But in the meantime, the Anthropocene has taken on a life of its own, with multiple exhibitions and symposia by museums, foundations, and research institutions in Europe, Australia, and North America, as well as a profusion of publications. So there's now 2 journals that are named after this term, and it's gotten a lot of public general press coverage. The implications of this concept have been interpreted in different ways, but there's no disagreement about the basic ingredients. So one, the idea that nature has been so thoroughly transformed that there is no outside to human agency anymore, no wilderness, no undomesticated realm, and no return to either of them because of climate change. And 2, that this impact and its consequences are global, so that no human community can extract itself from them or live outside them. So it's a fundamentally planetary framework of thinking, and really thinking about a whole new planetary state. So with that in mind, in the first part of my talk, I'll dwell a little more on these discussions around the Anthropocene and point out there's sometimes implicit and sometimes explicit use of tropes from speculative fiction, and specifically the idea of terraforming, both intentional and unintentional, accidental terraforming. And then in the second part, I'll zero in on the question of the city as the major future habitat of humankind, and a kind of environment where, of course, ideas of domestication and intervention have long made more sense than wilderness or restoration. The city is in various ways the quintessential Anthropocene environment, the place where nature has been so thoroughly transformed by humans that it's not experienced as nature anymore. So the challenge in urban environments is not finding an originary nature before human intervention, but to see human intervention as terraformed nature, and to understand cities as forms of nature, as novel ecosystems, as some biologists call them. And that's one of the central themes of 2312, the Robinson's novel, to which I'll return. And I'll contrast his utopian vision here with one of the best urban dystopias of the last decade, Paolo Bacigalupi's The Wind-Up Girl from 2009, as 2 versions of how you might think about cities in crisis, biocities in crisis, and cities in states of exception. So in this context, I'll point to Bacigalupi's implied criticism of the authoritarian power structures that accompany institutionalized environmentalism and of American climate exceptionalism. Robinson's novels reach beyond this critique to new forms of democracy and urbanism. And I'll then conclude with a brief look at a poetic text, Harriet Mullen's Urban Tumbleweed, that in a minimalist literary mode develops the kind of perception of the city by way of contemporary LA that Robinson develops as a fully realized utopian eco-urbanism. So I want to juxtapose there in the last part sort of a vision of the future with a vision of the present. All right, so that concept of the Anthropocene that I mentioned has been interpreted in, I think, 2 different ways. When you read Crutzen's own summary, the emphasis is definitely on the Anthropocene as a kind of state of exception, as a state of global crisis. So in a follow-up piece to the original essay he co-authored with Sturmer, he says, during the past 3 centuries, the human population has increased tenfold to more than 6 billion and is expected to reach 10 billion in this century. About 30 to 50% of the planet's surface is exploited by humans. Tropical rainforests disappear at a fast pace, releasing carbon dioxide and strongly increasing species extinction. Energy use has grown 16-fold during the 20th century, causing 160 million tons of atmospheric sulfur dioxide emissions per year, more than twice the sum of its natural emissions. Fossil fuel burning and agriculture have caused substantial increases in the concentrations of greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide by 30%, methane by more than 100%, reaching the highest levels over the past 400 millennia, with more to follow. And this is quite typical of the way in which the Anthropocene was talked about initially in a lot of the scientific literature. So this appears to us as a sort of catalog of just sober facts, but it nevertheless, of course, sounds like it's defining the Anthropocene as the sum of all environmental havocs that humans have wreaked on the planet. And so from that perspective, you could say that the Anthropocene is just a new word to mark the endpoint of the typical environmentalist narrative of decline, the hell where nature has been going in the proverbial handbasket for the last 200 years or so. So that's one major reading of the Anthropocene. But I think if that were all there is to it, if it just marked this sense of state of exceptional crisis, of a human impact that's catastrophic and has never been there before, if it were just, in other words, a restatement of quite familiar apocalyptic narratives, I think it's doubtful that it would have achieved the kind of influence that it now has. And you get a different view in some other kinds of publications. So one of the most vocal publicizers of the term has been the geographer Earl Ellis, who's working with various collaborators. And so he says in one of his numerous publications, human influence on the terrestrial biosphere is now pervasive. Most of nature is now embedded within anthropogenic mosaics of land use and land cover. And he calls this anthrones. While not intended to replace existing biome systems based on climate, terrain, and geology, we hope that wide availability of an anthropogenic biome system will encourage a richer view of human ecosystem interactions across the terrestrial biosphere, and that this will in turn guide our investigation, understanding, and management of ecosystem processes. Now that notion of anthrones rather than biomes resonates with terminology that other biologists have used. So think of the emphasis that Peter Kariva, the scientific director of the Nature Conservancy, has put on domesticated nature in recent years. Or the biologist Richard Hotze's suggestion that the term intervention ecology should now replace the older term restoration ecology, because you have climate change, you're not really going to be able to restore a lot of ecosystems to what they were 100 years ago or 200 years ago. And also his suggestion in a separate, relatively new publication that we should now focus on novel ecosystems that have been, at least in part, created by humans. The science writer Emma Maris has popularized such ideas in her widely discussed and controversial book, Rambunctious Garden, Saving Nature in a Post-Wild World. And I think it's ideas like these that the Anthropocene has become a shorthand for. Now, if you look at these publications, they contain an odd mix of description and prescription. So take an op-ed piece that Emma Maris, whom I just mentioned, co-authored with Earl Ellis and with Peter Kariva and another biologist, Joseph Mascaro. This was a couple of years ago in the New York Times, op-ed called Hope in the Age of Man, where they say the Anthropocene does not represent the failure of environmentalism. It is the stage on which a new, more positive and forward-looking environmentalism can be built. This is the Earth we have created, and we have a duty as a species to protect it and manage it with love and intelligence. It is not ruined. It is beautiful still, and can be even more beautiful if we work together and care for it. The environmental blogger Andy Revkin, who writes the blog .earth, which you may know, echoes that sentiment in a post called Embracing the Anthropocene. One clear reality is that for a long time to come, Earth is what we choose to make of it, for better or for worse. It's a celebration in a way, a deeper acceptance of our place on the planet with all our synthetic trappings and our faults as fundamentally natural. So for Revkin, as for Ellis and Maris, Kariva, and so forth, the Anthropocene is a new environmental orientation toward the future rather than the past, celebration rather than mourning, and a new sense that humans are able to transform the planet into what we want it to be. The optimism is even more marked at the end of Maris's Rambunctious Garden, where she concludes, "We forever altered the earth, and so now we cannot abandon it to a random fate. It is our duty to manage it. Luckily, it can be a pleasant, even joyful task if we embrace it in the right spirit. Let the rambunctious gardening begin." And for those of you who know German, there's a similar book that came out just right around the same time by Christian Schwegel called Menschenzeit, so the Age of Humans, which also ends on a not quite a celebratory note, but pretty close. And then you might have seen in recent weeks, Diane Ackerman's The Human Age has just come out, which is positively giddy with exuberance over the Anthropocene and humans' ingenuity, all the new technologies from nanotechnology to de-extinction to geoengineering that will shape our future. Now, it's hard, I think, not to sympathize with this optimism, especially if you have, in the past, criticized environmentalist discourse for its nostalgia, its elegiac moods, and the latent misanthropy in the reverence for wilderness, and called for more optimistic storylines, as I have. But it's a bit disconcerting that environmentalist decline stories are here being questioned by the return to a yet older Enlightenment narrative. It gives you pause to see the Anthropocene interpreted as, well, we've managed nature anyway, it's all human now, so let's go ahead and manage it better. What that perspective leaves out is that some of the most fundamental human transformations of the planet have taken place outside our intention and control. Climate change, toxification, biodiversity loss, to name just three of the big ones, those weren't planned or intended by anybody. And they came about as side effects of other activities, many of them so distributed over millions of humans that it took us a long time even to realize they were happening. So it seems like an odd conclusion to draw from these unintended consequences that we will, in the future, be able to manage the planet according to plan. Now, you can dismiss this leap as you know, just wishful thinking. You can understand it as an earnest but misguided attempt to think about ways to deal with global change, with this extraordinary crisis that we're facing. Or you can argue with Stuart Brand that we really have no choice. Now, you may remember that Stuart Brand, who started the whole Earth catalog, quipped in 1968 in one of the first issues of the whole Earth catalog, we are as gods and might as well get good at it. And he's repeated but slightly changed that slogan in his more recent book, Whole Earth Discipline, where he says on the first page, we are as gods and have to get good at it. Which is a change in wording that implies a different and, I think, more urgent, but possibly also more tragic sense of human eco-agency. Now, whichever interpretation you prefer in this cartoon, I think, kind of summarizes the two positions. What's interesting from the perspective of literary analysis is how much the science fiction motif of terraforming underwrites these visions of the future, and that's true both for the negative and the positive ones. Now, that's most obvious in the various proposals for geoengineering the Earth's atmosphere so as to mitigate climate change impacts, which I'm sure you've heard about. But science fiction motifs in general, and then terraforming in particular, have also infiltrated recent nonfiction writing on the environment by prominent authors like Alan Wiseman and Bill McKibben. So Bill McKibben's, one of his more recent books from 2010, Earth, Making Life on a Tough New Planet, quite explicitly adopts the trope of humans on an alien planet. So he says toward the beginning of this book, the world hasn't ended, but the world as we know it has, even if we don't quite know it yet. We imagine we still live on that old planet, that the disturbances we see around us are the old, random, and freakish kind. But they're not. It's a different place, a different planet. It needs a new name. Earth. Who knows how you, I mean, it's still pronounced for it's différence for you. It still looks familiar enough. We're still the third rock out from the sun system, full of water. Gravity still pertains, we're still Earth-like, but it's odd enough to constantly remind us how profoundly we've altered the only place we've ever known. So, seen from that perspective, the Anthropocene is a sci-fi trope that calls on us to see the Earth as an alien planet, terraformed by beginners who didn't quite know what they were doing, but who might be trained to do better in the future. And I'll just note in parenthesis that this is part of a more general drift of science fiction themes and narrative strategies outward from science fiction to mainstream fiction and mainstream authors, environmental ones prominently among them. And if I had a little more time, I would have added to the talk at this point a brief discussion of Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway's recent book, The Collapse of Western Civilization, which is sort of a follow-up to their book, Merchants of Doubt. It's about climate change. It purports to be science fiction, written from the point of view of a Chinese historian in 2393, looking back on the 21st century. As science fiction, it's terrible. But it's interesting that here a historian of science and a science writer would actually very explicitly fall back on the genre of science fiction to reiterate points that are already made in their nonfiction writing earlier. So this is an interesting, I think, more general phenomenon that deserves to be talked about, but not maybe today. Now, with all this in mind, let me briefly return to Robinson's work. Terraforming is the central topic in his epic trilogy, Red Mars, Green Mars, and Blue Mars from the 1990s. And in that trilogy, some of you might know, he paints an extraordinarily detailed, scientifically informed, and sociopolitically fascinating portrait of the engineering challenges and the cultural and political conflicts around the terraforming of Mars. These struggles result in sort of ambiguously utopian new society, and they map ambiguously onto continuing conflicts on Earth, still riven by economic inequality, ecological degradation, natural disasters, corporate exploitation, population growth, and military conflicts. And so in that dual portrait, sort of between the new Mars and the old Earth society, terraforming is caught up in a variety of fundamental questions. Should Mars be terraformed, or at least be partially preserved in its original state? Should it be terraformed or areoformed? That is, should or shouldn't Earth's ecosystems be the model for Mars? Once terraformed, does Mars offer paradigms that could be applied back to Earth to help alleviate that planet's escalating crises? Now, and I'm not going to talk about the trilogy in great detail here, since a lot of people have talked about it. Just as background, so what Robinson does in 2312 is revisit some of these questions, but he takes them up in a lighter tone and with some more experimental narrative strategies. Among other things, he intersperses his narrative with quotations from a variety of imaginary books, and with lists that convey a sense of the future world's different voices and provide interpretive frameworks for the unfolding plot. Now, one of these quotations that he throws in between chapters is an excerpt from what appears to be a manual on how to create a so-called terrarium, an artificial mini-biosphere that imitates one of Earth's ecosystems. So this book says, the book that's quoted in the novel says, take an asteroid at least 30 kilometers on its long axis, hollow out your asteroid, begin with a light dusting of heavy metals and rare earths. With the soil base cooked up, your biome is well on its way. I'm leaving a lot of stuff out here, this page is long. A lot of terraria designers start out with a marsh of some kind because it's the fastest way to bulk up your soil and your overall biomass. Over time, you can transform the interior of your terrarium to any of the 832 identified terran biomes, or design an ascension of your own making. Be warned that many ascensions fall as flat as bad souffles. So this is humorously styled as a kind of outer space cookbook, but this manual gives very detailed instructions on how to build up the biomes. And a later entry from a different manual portrays in a similarly joking tone the terraforming of the planet Venus that has already taken place in the fictional world of the novel. Take raw Venus. There's potential here for a great creation. Take one Saturnian ice moon, cutting it into chunks about 10 kilometers on a side. Attach mass drivers and send them down to Venus. So these terraforming experiments are the prelude for the return of several characters who were born on other planets or moons to Earth, where they lend a kind of development aid to a planet with 11 billion inhabitants that has undergone a 33-foot sea level rise since the 21st century. The protagonist is a designer and artist from Mercury, and she's not by temperament a patient person. And she and the other so-called spacers find Earth totally bewildering and frustrating. Decisions that are easy to make in the small settler societies on the other planets are infinitely harder in Earth's populous democracies. Terraforming decisions that are easy to make in environments that are not naturally hospitable to human life turn out to be really difficult on Earth, where every acre of land is contested territory in terms of ownership rights, historical memories, cultural traditions, and current uses. Nevertheless, some of these terraforming efforts bear fruit. So Florida, for example, which has gone completely underwater, is rebuilt at a higher level through the importation of vast quantities of rock from Canada. So it's sort of, Florida, second floor or something. And in one of the most spectacular scenes in the novel, hundreds of thousands of extinct animals that have been bred in these off-world terraria are re-released into the habitats where they used to live on Earth decades or centuries earlier. Now, this idea of terraforming, of course, isn't new. It's been around in science fiction since the early 1940s. What's interesting that in Robinson, it's reapplied back to Earth. So it's no longer only other planets, but Earth itself that's being re-engineered in its overall structures. And Robinson puts this plot element quite explicitly into the context of the Anthropocene, the idea that humans have already, intentionally or not, transformed the entire planet. So Earth, in this view, is constantly being made and remade just as Mercury is, in the scene that I quoted at the beginning. So for our discussion here, the Anthropocene means, on one hand, thinking at a planetary scale, and on the other hand, focusing on domesticated nature, nature remade by humans. And that moves me into the second part of my talk. So that also means rethinking nature as city, not an other or outside to the city. As you may know, the World Health Organization declared a historical threshold in 2008, the point at which, according to its data, the number of humans who live in cities crossed the 50% threshold for the first time in the history of the species. So these are some of the graphs that, a couple of the graphs that have come out of the studies of the World Health Organization and the UN, where you see sort of the steep rise in urbanization in various parts of the world. And this is sort of the crossover of urban and rural, which, as you can see, happens somewhere, just sort of around just before 2010, where we now, for the first time in the history of humankind, rural populations are going down and urban populations are overtaking them. Now, there's been some debate over what density counts as a city in the WHO survey, but nobody contests the general tendency. Cities around the world are growing, and all future population growth will either end up in cities or start out there in the first place. And so when we're talking about this, we're not talking mainly charismatic or well-known megacities. We're not talking Tokyo, Shanghai, Lagos, or Mexico City. Much of the growth is already happening in cities in China and India that you and I have never heard of, but that actually have 700 million inhabitants, like New York. So the future habitat of humankind, according to these projections, is the city, and for a good part of our population, very large cities, whereas the percentage of people working in agriculture and living in rural areas will continue to shrink. So the ecosystems we'll inhabit in the future are urban ones. So that means not just paying closer attention to the green spaces that form part of cities across the globe. So gardens, parks, and wild areas in the city have always been focal points for conservationists and environmentalism more generally. More recently, conservation efforts have also focused on the blue spaces of riverbeds, lakes, and creeks, and the staggering number of empty lots in those cities, which often spontaneously become spaces for vegetation and wild and feral animal life. Beyond that, urban nature also means understanding cities as what some biologists, as I already mentioned, call novel ecosystems with properties of their own. So we know that cities generate their own temperature environments, that sort of heat island effect, and that they contain very high biodiversity, which has not been studied in detail because biologists usually prefer to focus on ecosystems with a good deal of native flora and fauna rather than the mixes and hybrids that dominate urban space. All of this is, at some level, part of terraforming. It is human-made nature. And you could argue that city building is actually one of the most important technologies humans have invented. So for environmentalism, that means, and for the environmental humanities, that means Leopold's land ethic has also to become an urban space ethic. Now, in architecture, design, urban planning, and urban history, nature has played an enormous role over the last 15 years, all the way from decarbonized transportation, energy-efficient architecture, and urban farming to what Javier Arbona has called climate urbanism. And I've put on the slide here just the names of some of the theoretical paradigms, some of which you might be familiar with, or not, depending on how much attention you pay to developments in urban studies. So these are all various attempts to think about environments and environmentalism in the city. So climate urbanism is the attempts to just rethink urban planning and design wholesale in view of climate change. And you see this in cities from New York to New Orleans and so forth. So landscape urbanism, urban metabolism, which is sort of a neo-Marxist approach, urban political ecology, ditto, it's sort of a combination of urban studies with environmental justice. Biophilic design and other movements and paradigms have transformed these fields in their assumptions, if not always in their practices. Contemporary urban literature has begun to catch up with these transformations, especially where nonfiction is concerned. Think of the works of Mike Davis, Andrew Ross, or Matthew Kahn. But novels and poems that engage with urban ecology in depth still remain relatively rare. There's Patrick Chamoiseau's Martinique novel Texaco from 1992, Karen Yamashita's Tropic of Orange, which is about Los Angeles, and they both do present an urban nature in its full complexity, entangled with political histories and current class divisions. But then there's other important urban novels of the last 10 years. Think, China Miegel's The City and the City, or Jonathan Letham's Chronic City, William Gibson's Pattern Recognition, or Teju Cole's Open City. Either don't engage with environmental issues, or they integrate them as part of sociocultural background noise, sort of items in the average American's portfolio of neurotic obsessions, but nothing more than that. On the other hand, you have novels such as Lydia Millet's How the Dead Dream and also Magnificence, which engage very seriously with biodiversity and extinction, but then tend to cast the city pretty conventionally as the antithesis to nature rather than as an instantiation of it. But speculative fiction and film have taken up issues of urban ecology. Give the disaster movie, despite all its intellectual and aesthetic shortfalls, credit for providing a handy template for turning climate change into suspenseful plots. I'm thinking here of Roland Emmerich's The Day After Tomorrow, or more recently Neil Blomkamp's Elysium. And so there is a certain template there for how you deal with a sort of urban state of exception that disaster creates. Now, Paolo Bacigalupi combines crises of climate, agriculture, and biodiversity in his award-winning novel, The Wind-Up Girl from 2009. So in his future, which is, it's not sort of very explicitly dated, it's about 150 years into the future, more or less, the world has been devastated by sea level rise, and even more by constantly mutating plagues and pests that agribusiness corporations are barely able to stay one step ahead of by constant genetic re-engineering. Thailand is the only country that has been able to offer resistance to the so-called calorie companies, a great idea, the chemical and agricultural corporations from the north, because it has meticulously maintained an archive of uncontaminated seeds, whose genes the Thai engineers and environmentalists call upon to create new, at least temporarily plague-resistant crops. Bangkok, the city of divine beings, or city of angels, has been saved from flooding by an act of royally mandated civic engineering, a system of dikes, locks, and pumps, but it's flooded by what one of the Environment Ministry's top officials considers a metaphorical ocean, and this is toward the beginning of the novel. So he thinks, he looks out at the city and he says, protecting the kingdom from all the infections of the natural world is like trying to catch the ocean with a net. One can snare a certain number of fish, sure, but the ocean is always there, surging through. Pollen wafts down the peninsula in steady surges, bearing aborigines and pure calcareous genetic rewrites, while Cheshires, those are genetically engineered cats, molt through the garbage of the soys, and Jingjok 2 lizards, engineered lizards, vandalize the eggs of nightjar and peafowl. Ivory beetles bore through the forests of Khao Yai, even as Cibiscosis sugars, Listerus, and Fagon fringe bore through the vegetables and huddled humanity of Chrome Tep. It is the ocean they all swim in, the very medium of life. And that genetically pervasively re-engineered nature also includes humans, among them one of the protagonists, the Japanese wind-up Emiko. And so they're called wind-ups because their genetic programming includes the unnecessary stutter-stop movements of older mechanical imitations of the human, which the Japanese gene engineers just added for aesthetic effect. So Emiko is appreciated for her grace and beauty in her homeland Japan, but she experiences Bangkok as a nightmare of discrimination, violence, and sexual exploitation. City and nation are riven by struggles between the powerful environment minister, and we see his thoughts here in this passage, and the Minister of Trade over commerce and protectionism, nativism and international engagement, and varying alliances with the Queen, the commoners, and foreigners representing the calorie companies. The world beyond Thailand presents an even more apocalyptic scenario of corporate exploitation, power politics, rampant ecological crisis, and mass death. So it is really bleak novel, but brilliantly written. Chrome Tap goes under at the end, as cities tend to do in dystopian fiction and film, even and especially when they're conceived on the model of a fortress, which this Bangkok of the future is. So at the end of the novel, the destroyed locks and sabotage pumps take 6 days to kill the city of Divine Cities. Emiko watches from the balcony of the finest apartment tower in Bangkok as the water rushes in. On the 6th day, Her Royal Majesty the Child Queen announces the abandonment of the Divine City. Slowly, the city empties. The lap of seawater and the yowl of Cheshires replaces the call of durian sellers and the ring of bicycle bells. At times, Emiko suspects that she's the only person living. She isn't, but she's certainly the person with the best chances of survival into the long-term future, since she's very intelligent, she can sometimes move at superhuman speed, and she's, most importantly, immune to the new diseases. So along with the Cheshires, the genetically engineered cat successors, and the multifarious biotech flora and fauna, she stands for the future in Bacigalupi's world, for the new nature that humans have created. And the fact that she does have a future, and even a community of similar new people, becomes, at the end of the novel, the sort of little utopian silver lining on what's otherwise a relentlessly bleak futuristic horizon. And even that doesn't feel like much of a utopia because it's announced by one of the most sinister characters in the novel, and the unscrupulous biotech genius Gibbons, who had earlier in the novel made the case against conservation. So he says to one of the employees of the Environment Ministry, the ecosystem unraveled when man first went seafaring, when we first lit fires on the broad savannas of Africa. We have only accelerated the phenomenon. The food web you talk about is nostalgia, nothing more. Nature, we are nature. Our very tinkering is nature, our every biological striving. We are what we are, and the world is ours. We are its gods. Here are a few echoes of Stuart Brand there. You die now because you cling to the past. We should all be wind-ups by now. It's easier to build a person impervious to blister us than to protect an earlier version of the human creature. You cling to some idea of a humanity that evolved in concert with your environment over millennia, and which you now, perversely, refuse to remain in lockstep with. Blister us is our environment. Symbiscosis, gene hack weevil, Cheshires, they have adapted. Our environment has changed. If we wish to remain at the top of our food chain, we will evolve, or we will refuse and go the way of the dinosaurs and Felis domesticus. So the biologically as well as culturally hybrid, re-engineered, and ultimately flooded city of Bangkok becomes the symbol and the material incarnation of, this remade world, this state of exception of the Anthropocene. The city that has been invaded by nature in such a way that it turns into a nightmare for all of those unwilling or unable to adapt. Now, Robinson's 2312 juxtaposes ingenious new cities and habitats humans have created across the solar system with an Earth that, not unlike Bacigalupi's, suffers, as I mentioned earlier, from ecological crises and military conflicts, corporate exploitation, and other ingredients of dystopia. And as I mentioned earlier, the spacers sort of come back to Earth to try and help remedy some of this pervasive crisis, but find themselves often stymied by Earth's own traditions and procedures. So it's their alien perspective in the novel that drives home Robinson's analysis of what the world has become politically and ecologically in the Anthropocene. So we're seeing the Earth through the eyes of people who are not born on Earth. And it's that alien perspective that makes the city accessible as a natural space, in contrast to its usual portrayal as either biological wasteland or playground for new human-made biology that ranges from dysfunctional to nightmarish, which is, of course, what you kind of get in Bacigalupi. So Robinson, too, imagines a flooded metropolis in early 4th century Manhattan after a 33-foot sea level rise induced by climate change. So he looks at just the kind of premise that in Emmerich or in Bacigalupi provokes urban apocalypse. So look at what he does with this. A few parts of Manhattan's ground still stood above water, but most of it was drowned. The old streets now canals, the city an elongated Venice, a skyscraper Venice, a super Venice, which was a very beautiful thing to be. Indeed, it was an oft-expressed cliche that the city had been improved by the flood. The long stretch of skyscrapers looked like the spine of a dragon. The foreshortening effect as they got closer made the buildings look shorter than they really were, but their verticality was unmistakable and striking, a forest of dolmens. Swan, so she's the Swan or Hong is the protagonist from Mercury, got off the ferry at the 13th Street Pier and walked on the broad catwalk between buildings to the High Line extension, where people filled the long plaza stretching north and south. Manhattan on foot, workers pushing narrow handcarts on crowded skyways, connecting island neighborhoods suspended between skyscrapers at differing heights. The rooftops were garnished with greenery, but the city was mostly a thing of steel and concrete and glass and water. Boats burbled about on the water below the catwalks, in the streets that were now crowded canals. All the aerial plazas and catwalks were jammed with people. So this is really very surprising in science fiction, right? Instead of urban disaster, Robinson's utopian imagination conjures up another Calvino-type Venice-inflected scenario in which climate change, combined with human ingenuity and engineering know-how, creates a new aerial aquatic cityscape. It seems implausible that the High Line, Manhattan's paradigmatic conversion of an old elevated tram line into a park, and you've probably heard that the last segment of it was just opened a few weeks ago, would still be there 300 years into the future. But the reference is a strategic reminder of contemporary, highly successful projects of urban renewal that merge green and gray spaces in new ways. But if it's the artificiality, even the surreality of the cityscape that makes it striking to us, the most astonishing and exhilarating thing about it for Swan or Hong, the protagonist from Mercury, is its exposure to nature. Lying down in the middle of a parking lot, she grows exhilarated at the blue sky, the wind, the ability to move about outside domed habitats and without spacesuits, the cries of gulls and the flow of water. It's one of the most nature-bound environments she's ever been in. And through this perspective, Robinson makes us see even the densest and most obviously human-built cityscapes as part and parcel of planetary ecosystems. So conceptually, as well as in terms of narrative technique, the city here, as in Bashigalupi, provides the template for thinking about terraformed planets and the wholesale transformation of nature through human agency. Robinson reinforces this idea through strategic reuse of narrative techniques that first emerged in the high modernist urban novels of the early 20th century. So, as I mentioned earlier, in between the narrative chapters, he inserts these quotations from fictional books, which I gave you a couple of, lists of new inventions or old customs, passages characterizing human settlements on a particular asteroid, moon, or planet. And that technique, if you follow it back, the novel most closest in time that uses similar technique is David Brin's novel Earth from 1990. That novel similarly featured excerpts from books, online archives, and internet chat groups. All this, mind you, 3 years before Tim Berners-Lee introduced the Mosaic browser and the internet as we know it today. So this is going back a truly astonishing novel to read because it has these online chat groups before there was any internet. In addition, he has TV news updates and italicized passages at the beginning of sections that recount the geological history of planet Earth as a kind of Bildungsroman. Now, Brin himself very closely imitates John Brunner's technique in his 1968 science fiction novel, Stand on Zanzibar, a novel about the global growth of cities and urban violence, which used a very similar segments from news items, television, and book extracts to develop its vision of the planet as a whole. At the time, that technique attracted a lot of attention and a lot of criticism, which Brunner responded to rather acerbically by pointing out that these techniques had been used for over 40 years in modernist urban novels, but were evidently still too much of the avant-garde to be tolerated by a literarily reactionary science fiction public. And specifically, he mentioned Dos Passos, and his use of newsreels and bits of advertising. And once you establish that genealogy back to Dos Passos, it becomes easy to see the derivation of Robinson's techniques from the mix of discourses in James Joyce's Ulysses, Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, Platon's Nadja, or de Been's Berlin Alexanderplatz. So in other words, from the fragmenting of narrative architecture that occurred in modernist novelists' attempts to translate the diversity and simultaneity of the modern metropolis into narrative. So a particular kind of modernist urban storytelling informs Robinson's fictionalization of planetary natures transformed by humans, as it did in Brunner and Brin. Another detail highlights this genealogy just as forcefully. So in the second half of the novel, there are several short interpolated passages that are titled Quantum Walk. And Quantum Walk 1 starts like this. A street, out in the street, move naturally, be alert. Don't make eye contact. That will be hard. Hope is the thing with feathers, buildings massed to the sides of the street, surface foam silicate lightly brushed for better footing, by a circular broom, tines 200 millimeters apart, each sweep erased part of a previous pair of sweeps, surcharge and overlapping concentricities. A stranger on the edge of town, green moss, green grass, marigold, calendula, yellow. A male scrub jay drops bluely onto flagstone puddle in gap between street and power strip. Wall of tram station, jay hops in puddle. Humans talking to other humans. Perpetually, they pass the Turing test. It isn't very hard to do. Ask a question, seem distracted. So the lack of capitalization and punctuation, the sentence fragments, and the odd spacing turn these passages into a kind of modern poetry. So somewhere in between Emily Dickinson's Thing with Feathers and Imagist poetry. It's also a kind of stream of consciousness, sort of the urban perceptions of a flaneur with a sharp eye for technological as well as natural detail and an unnatural mathematical ability. And as the reference to the Turing test in the last stanza here betrays, though, it's not a human flaneur, but a transhuman one, a new kind of person that in the novel emerges from a conjunction of quantum computers, so-called cubes, with other kinds of artificial intelligence. So it's a new kind of urban subject and subjectivity that's mapped here with some of the time-honored devices of modernist urban novels and poems. So, the urban understood as a certain kind of narrative and stylistic matrix is imprinted on the novel when it deals with cities, but also when it deals with a transformation of entire continents, moons, or planets. So urban space comes to serve as a thematic trope as well as a narrative template to reimagine land in the Anthropocene, in a context in which humans have thoroughly transformed nature and have done so at a planetary scale. But while Bacigalupi uses his dystopian urban nature as a form of political critique, Robinson moves beyond criticism to imagine new kinds of natural spaces and new kinds of social order. And that moves me into a third, mercifully short part of my talk, the politics of walking, just to say a little bit more about what the politics here is, and to bring it back sort of to the present day. There's a great deal, we could say, that has been said, of course, on Robinson's complex political utopianism. So Mars in his future has become a kind of socialist utopia, but it's acquired so much power that it actually turns into a threat to other communities in the solar system, and some of those organize themselves around something called the Mondragon Accord, that's named after a cooperative in the Basque Country, and which various particular communities join and drop out of. So there are a range of post-capitalist economies and social structures that Robinson imagines in the future, none of them unchangeable, none of them perfect, none of them always in all respects utopian. Instead of trying to do full justice to the political vision here, that would be impossible and we'd be here until tomorrow, I'd like to zero in on one particular cultural meme through which some of it is articulated, and that is walking in the city. So the quantum walk passages, of course, build on precisely this meme and the central role it plays in modernist literature, from Edgar Allan Poe's Man of the Crowd to Charles Baudelaire's Un peintre de la vie moderne, Robert Walser's A Stroll, Ein Spaziergang, and Walter Benjamin's work on Charles Baudelaire. And then you find it, of course, in modernist novels, Leopold Bloom, Clarissa Dalloway, Franz Bieberkopf, Bertrand Nadja, and so on. So the dynamics of the stroller, who's both part of and outside the urban community, whose strolling in fact raises the question of whether there is such a thing as an urban community and what it consists of, is here compounded by the fact that Robinson's flaneur is not human. Who participates in urban politics and on what terms? Who is excluded and on what grounds? How much of what the stroller sees is also within reach of his or her political agency? What might his or her particular kind of perception contribute to urban politics? At the same time, of course, the figure of the stroller also connects to the walker or hiker as a central figure in the American environmental imagination, from Thoreau's walking essay to Cheryl Strayed's Wild, Lost and Found on the Pacific Crest Trail, which we talked about during lunch today, and which is now coming out as a movie. In the strolling here, it raises the question of urban community and politics and its inclusions and exclusions in yet another way, through the mixed attention to details of technology and nature. As in Swan Erhong's experience of Manhattan as a thoroughly natural space, The cube human's acute awareness of plants and animals in the urban space helps to naturalize it. It's another sort of alien type perspective that's independent from the ingrained human perception of the city as the antithesis of nature. And so therefore that perspective is able to see its natural and technological constructiveness as just part of the same continuum. So the details of everyday perception in this way become connected to questions of community, politics, and democracy. The human city turns into what urban theorist Jennifer Walsh has called zoopolis, or more broadly, a trans-species space. Now, the same strategy also structures a recent text on urban nature that looks on the surface totally different from Robinson's. It's Harriet Mullen's poetry volume, Urban Tumbleweed, which came out just a few months ago in late 2013. It's subtitled Notes from a Tanka Diary and consists of 366 30-syllable poems about urban nature, mostly but not only in Los Angeles. The form is adapted from a classical Japanese verse form that tended to express highly stylized perceptions of a highly aestheticized nature. Mullen keeps the syllable count, but distributes the syllables over 3 lines in a way that wasn't part of the Japanese form, and she turns her perception to a space that conventionally wasn't supposed to have any nature at all. As you may remember, the environmental historian Jenny Price's well-known essay 13 Ways of Seeing Nature in LA makes the claim that there is no nature in the city is one of the many stories that is told about it. So while domestic, managed, accidental, literal, metaphorical, and all kinds of nature come in front of the stroller's eyes. Now, some of these poems sound fairly conventional at first sight. Hummingbird alters its course, zooming closer to check out the giant hibiscus flower, or Only Me in My Red Summer Dress, or a profusion of oleanders to beautify the freeway and filter the air, though leaf, stem, and blossom all are poison. Or would have said this purple clustered flower looks like a burst of fireworks, but of course it's the fireworks that imitate the flower. And so this question of what's original and what's imitation, what is literal and what's metaphorical already shows up in this last poem, as do questions of misdirection, misrecognition, and disorientation. And that keeps recurring, among other things, in the poem that the volume's title is derived from. Urban tumbleweed, some people call it, discarded plastic bag we see in every city, blown down the street with vagrant wind. The point here is not the seemingly arbitrary attachment of a natural metaphor to a thoroughly artificial product. Something from the consumer world, one that's so ubiquitous that it has itself become an environmental risk. It's that the nature that the metaphor derives from is itself uprooted and on the move, as we found out later. Even itinerant tumbleweed had roots attaching it to the land before its stem snapped and strong winds pushed it down the road. And once you start reading it like that, it's not just Mullen herself who's an urban flaneur in this volume of poetry. Certainly, she emphasizes in a few introductory pages that walking and taking public transit instead of driving opened up a different perception of the urban for her, and of a nature for which she had no vocabulary. She wasn't a gardener, bird watcher, or environmentalist. This switch of perception directly corresponds to the altered awareness of urban nature in Robinson's post-human and transhuman flaneurs. But for Mullen, urban nature itself is the flaneur. It's what's constantly mobile, on the move, going where it's not supposed to be. Hence the oleanders on freeway medians, the non-natives that have made their way to LA, just as Mullen herself, not born there, has. Non-native ice plant on postage stamps represents the Golden State, like a governor whose tongue gets tangled in California. Another poem runs, explicitly connecting introduced plant species to the governor from Austria. So immigrants who die from eating toxic mushrooms that look like edible ones in their native country, homeless people walked out from parks, and other poems foreground how neither people, animals, nor plants are where they should be in LA, and that is exactly the nature of the city. So nature, like culture, presents itself as a heterogeneous assemblage caught up in constant mobility and displacement. Now, all of this may seem like a far cry from Robinson's Terminator, which after all is a very managed environment for all that it also is in perpetual motion. But remember that inside and outside of Terminator, the citizens of Mercury constantly remake their living environment, as do the designers of the terraria that imitate Earth's biomes. As we saw, the designers also make up new kinds of ecosystems that they call ascensions.